readings for this week is Huntington's Clash of Civilizations article. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about this because I think it needs to be put in sort of a larger context and maybe the limits of it discussed, because Huntington's theory and thesis, while it's widely discussed and widely sort of referenced, the scholarship on it is a little bit more complicated and nuanced than you would get from the initial article. So the basic thrust of Huntington's article, and again, he's writing in the early 1990s, the same time that Francis Fukuyama was writing his sort of thesis about the end of history, this time of incredible change in the international system. The Soviet Union has collapsed. We have a sort of an upsurge of civil wars. The system seems to be changing. And Huntington says that, look, the Cold War's over. The ideological struggles between the Soviet system and the capitalist system, those are done. We're all sort of in agreement. But that doesn't mean that we're sort of moving toward this world of peace and harmony the way that sort of Francis Fukuyama suggests we are. Instead, Huntington says there's going to be a new division in the international system, and that's a division built around civilization. Particularly, he focuses on the tension that's going to exist between the West and the rest, other civilizations versus Western civilization. And he says there's going to be cultural differences that are going to dominate sort of the next several generations. Now, I want to flag again that there are a lot of problems with this theory. It is incredibly simplistic. Of course, that's true of all theories. There are some real problems with how he's defining civilization. We'll talk about that in a second. And it has a limit similar to the ancient hatreds thesis of ethnic conflict, that we see inter-civilizational conflict, sure, but we also see long periods of cooperation across civilizational lines, and we see civilizations that simply don't have conflict. And the Clash of Civilizations thesis doesn't really give us a whole lot of way to explain that. But nonetheless, theories aren't true or false. They're useful or not useful. So let's talk about some of the usefulness, potentially, of the Clash of Civilizations thesis. So here's what Huntington sort of defines as civilizations. This is a slightly simplified map, but it's color-coded in a way that makes it a little bit more readable. He talks about Western civilization, which is essentially US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. There's the Orthodox world, sort of Ukraine, Poland, Russia. There's Latin America. There's the Muslim world, which stretches from sort of North Africa on into the Middle East, up into Central Asia, over into South Asia and Southeast Asia. You've got Hindu civilization, which is basically Nepal and India, and then China and Vietnam for Sinic civilization. You've got this Buddhist civilization. And then you've got states like Japan, some of the former British colonies in the Caribbean, and these sort of lone countries, Ethiopia, Israel, Turkey, that just don't really fit anywhere else with anyone else, that are sort of off on their own. So Huntington's sort of painted with these broad strokes, and in doing so, he's divided up the world into, I think, reasonable classifications, oftentimes built around religion, but there's also a lot of complexity that's lost in this. And so I'd point to maybe India as the seat of Hindu civilization. India has 1.2 billion people, of which 300 million of them are Muslim. Roughly, India is roughly the world's second largest Muslim population. It just happens to have a lot more Hindus in it. Similarly, if we look at sort of the Muslim world, we're covering a huge amount of complexity. The experience of being Muslim in Southeast Asia versus North Africa is going to be very different. The experience of being Muslim is going to be different whether you are Sunni or Shia or Sufi, depending on different sects that are sort of lost in this simplifying, paint everything yellow and say it's all the same. And Huntington's lack of sort of internal division that the civilizations don't capture, I think, is a critique that fits in a lot of different places. Northern Europe versus Southern Europe, West Africa versus East Africa versus South Africa, on and on and on. But let's back up and talk about sort of how Huntington thinks civilization is supposed to play out. And so we'll work through the causal mechanisms. The basic idea is that we're living in a world that's increasingly globalized. We're interacting with communication, we're interacting with trade, and while in the past people would more or less interact primarily with people from their own civilization, what's happening with globalization is we're interacting across civilizational lines, and maybe we're even moving toward a common global culture through this process of cross-civilizational interaction. Unfortunately, from Huntington's perspective, this is a problem. Civilizations fundamentally do not understand each other. They have very basic differences in terms of how they view the world, in terms of how they understand the relationship between the individual and the community, the individual and the state, the individual and God, the relationship between men and women, how parents versus children are supposed to be interacting. All of these just fundamental, basic assumptions we have about the world and how it works are different. The symbols and the ideas and the stories that resonate with us within civilizations don't resonate across civilizational lines. And so what ends up happening is, as we interact across civilizational lines, we bump into each other. We step on each other's toes. We engage in cultural misunderstanding that inflames or enrages or infuriates, people on the other side. And so one example that I think Huntington might point to, were Huntington still alive today, would be the Danish cartoon controversy. A couple years back, there was this Danish cartoonist who depicted the Prophet Muhammad with some sort of bomb as a turban, and this set off, riots of fury across different parts of the Muslim world, that this sacred figure would be depicted in this way, and embassies were stormed and people were killed. And in the West, we might look at this and say, that makes no sense. It's a drawing, it's a cartoon, it's part of this larger conversation of free speech, and the ability to be an iconoclast and smash ideas that are held sacred is fundamental to how we have a conversation in the West, whereas in the Islamic world, you might look at that and say, no, this is something that's outside the bounds of normal conversation and normal satirism, and you would only go in that direction if you had a real desire to harm the feelings and the beliefs of a people. And so there's that fundamental misunderstanding about what these symbols and how we use them works. Now, so far, I am 100% behind Huntington on this. Basically, he's telling a story about how if you put people with fundamentally different beliefs in a small room, they're going to annoy each other. And I think we can all say that, yes, that can happen. The Clash of Civilizations thesis, however, goes a step further, and this is where I think most scholars sort of hesitate to follow Huntington. Huntington says when these clashes, when this tension emerges between individuals or across country lines, what ends up happening is there's this galvanizing effect that states, glom on into civilizational blocks and say, you've insulted my fellow member of this civilization, I'm going to support them, I'm going to help them. And what turns out, initially what begins as two people misunderstanding each other turns into these civilizational wide conflicts. This is problematic in terms of the data, and it's really hard to point to an example of this happening. In fact, I can come up with almost no evidence that this is correct. When we look at whether or not people get into fights, just regular fights, it seems that people are just as likely to fight with those who are part of their own civilization as they are to fight with people of a different civilization. That holds for interstate wars where two countries are fighting, and it also holds for civil wars, that civil wars are just as likely to happen within civilizations as across civilizations. And so we might look at the example of Sudan, and a lot of people would point to the tension between North Sudan and South Sudan as part of the civilizational fight. They were once part of the same country, and the South succeeded because the North was Muslim and was Arab, and the South was more Black African and Christian or animist. And there was that civilizational cultural tension, sure, but there's also been a civil war in Darfur, the west of Sudan, in which case you have a Muslim population there rebelling against a government that is also largely Muslim. And so we see, even within a single country, that sort of incompleteness of explanation. The other thing I would flag is that when we look for examples of this galvanizing effect, it's just not there even where we might expect it to be. So I'll give you the example of September 11th. And September 11th was oftentimes interpreted as an example of, civilizations clashing. And sure enough, you get this sort of radical group in Afghanistan that launches an attack on the West, and Western countries, through the mechanism of NATO, say this has been an attack on one of our members and we're going to respond. And NATO attacks Afghanistan, invades Afghanistan, topples the Taliban, and tries to put in place a new government. That on the surface might look like civilizations galvanizing, but you also have this sort of NATO organization that existed beforehand. When we look for galvanization and unifying within the Islamic community, we see nothing. In fact, Pakistan and Uzbekistan and other countries that would be part of the Muslim world helped, facilitated, supported the U.S. invasion, and nobody came to Afghanistan's defense, helped the Taliban. So there's a real lack of galvanization there. On top of that, in Tehran, in Iran, after September 11th, there were protests in the streets. Millions of people turned out in the streets of Iran to protest against al-Qaeda, to protest against the Taliban, and in favor of the United States. And so again, that's something that doesn't fit within that sort of civilizational framework. Another example we might point to would be the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Here you've got a conflict that's crossing civilizational lines. But with that conflict, instead of the West unifying, what we end up seeing is Britain and siding with the United States and invading Iraq, but France and Germany pushing very hard to stop the war and to prevent the war, and really being critical of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Similarly, within the Islamic world, you get states like Turkey that sort of say, no, we aren't going to help, we're not going to support this, we don't like this. You get lots of criticism, but you also have states like Kuwait saying, this would be great, we would love for you to invade Iraq, come use our territory as a staging area for this invasion. And so again, we don't really see this dynamic of states coming to the aid of Iraq because of some sort of Western outside the civilization threat. And this is basically the problem with Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. While it resonates pretty well up through steps 1, 2, and 3, when we get to step 4, we just don't see the kind of evidence that it would take to really build this into something that explains the international system on a daily basis.